What if I told you that a single phone call, a simple proposal, could have reshaped the trajectory of one of the most scrutinized couples in modern royal history, and yet it ended in outright rejection? That's exactly what happened when Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, armed with ambition, hope, and a meticulously crafted plan, reached out to the Australian government, seeking permission for a royal tour that they believed would restore their relevance and charm a nation that had once adored them. But what they didn't expect was the firm, unyielding no that awaited them. A refusal delivered not in whispers, but in a statement so deliberate, so decisive, that it sent shockwaves through both royal and political circles. And the reasons behind this decision are as fascinating as they are alarming. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine this. Australia, a country steeped in royal tradition, a land where the Commonwealth ties run deep, where the monarchy has historically been celebrated and embraced, suddenly saying no to the most famous American-educated royal couple on the planet. For many, it's unthinkable. For others, it is the inevitable outcome of years of missteps, miscalculations, and an increasingly volatile public image. But to understand why this rejection happened, and why it matters now more than ever, we have to start by looking behind the curtain. The strategy, the desperation, the psychology, and, ultimately, the politics that converge to create a perfect storm of rejection. Let's rewind for a moment to why Meghan and Harry even wanted this tour. After stepping back from royal duties, after their high-profile interviews, their Hollywood ventures, and their constant global media presence, they faced a unique problem: relevance. Once adored, now scrutinized. Once influential, now polarizing. Their attempts to maintain public visibility and influence were increasingly met with skepticism, criticism, and, at times, outright mockery. Australia was supposed to be a reset button, a golden opportunity to re-establish themselves as beloved figures in the Commonwealth, a nation where Harry's grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, had long been respected, and where William and Catherine had left a trail of goodwill during previous visits. They believed that if they could charm Australia, they could charm the world, rehabilitate their image, and regain the aura of royal favorability that had slipped through their fingers. But here's the first shock. The Australian government wasn't just hesitant, it was strategically resistant. Think about that. Governments typically see royal visits as opportunities, photo ops, soft power wins, and media spectacle. Yet, in this case, they chose caution over celebration, optics over tradition, restraint over indulgence. And it wasn't merely a reflection of personal dislike for the couple. It was a calculated, politically informed decision. A decision informed by history, by public sentiment, and by a meticulous understanding of the ramifications of endorsing figures who are simultaneously loved, reviled, and infinitely scrutinized. Now, consider the emotional stakes for Meghan and Harry. This wasn't a casual request for a holiday or a private engagement. This was a highly strategic, meticulously planned attempt to position themselves as indispensable, admired, and, most importantly, still relevant to the global public. The rejection wasn't just a logistical inconvenience. It was a personal blow, an affront to their self-perceived status, and a crack in the carefully constructed narrative they had spent years building. For Meghan, who had cultivated a brand of charisma, influence, and modern royalty, it struck at the heart of her identity. For Harry, who has long struggled to balance loyalty to family with his desire for independence and public service, it was a public embarrassment magnified by private frustration. You might ask yourself, why Australia? Why now? The answer is layered. On one hand, Australia represents a crucial symbol in the Commonwealth, a nation that had historically embraced royal tours with enthusiasm, where previous engagements by senior royals had been met with massive fanfare. On the other, the country is politically astute, sensitive to public opinion, and increasingly aware of the media dynamics surrounding high-profile figures. They knew that allowing Meghan and Harry in would inevitably ignite public debate, spark media frenzy, and potentially cause political headaches, especially as Republican sentiment subtly rises and public patience with royal spectacle wanes. A decision to say yes might have been applauded by diehard royalists but condemned by critics, activists, and those wary of what the Sussex brand now represents. And let's not forget the lingering shadow of past royal visits. Memories of the 2018 tour, where tensions between the Sussexes and various staffers reportedly flared behind the scenes, were still fresh. Australia remembers, and so do its officials. From perceived entitlement to media gaffes, the narrative surrounding Meghan and Harry was already complicated. Repeating past mistakes on a new stage, under intense scrutiny, was a risk the government wasn't willing to take. They weren't just rejecting a tour. They were rejecting a potential political and cultural headache before it even began. But here's the twist. Meghan and Harry didn't approach this casually. Far from it. Their team, accustomed to crafting narratives, building anticipation, and controlling media optics, executed a sophisticated strategy. Emails were drafted, phone calls scheduled, intermediaries deployed, all designed to present a flawless pitch, a royal visit that would charm the public, bolster the Commonwealth's image, and secure favorable media coverage worldwide. They believed the optics were on their side. They assumed that the emotional appeal, the combination of celebrity and royalty, would be irresistible. Yet, what they did not anticipate was the deep undercurrent of political calculation and national self-interest that would override any appeal to emotion or spectacle. So what happened when the request landed on the Prime Minister's desk? According to sources close to the matter, the initial reaction was not outrage, but careful consideration, almost clinical in its approach. Senior officials analyzed the risks, debated the optics, and considered the historical context. They thought about cost, security, political repercussions, and public perception. And somewhere along that process, it became clear the potential downsides outweighed any benefit. The decision crystallized, not in a moment of caprice, but as the result of a strategic, deliberate, and unmistakable rejection. At this point, you may be wondering, how did Meghan and Harry react? It's human nature to imagine a bombshell headline or an emotional meltdown, but the reality, as we will explore in the chapters to come, was far more complex. Shock, certainly. Frustration, undoubtedly. Attempts to salvage, reframe, and manipulate the narrative, absolutely. They attempted to spin, to leverage allies, to appeal to media channels, and to circumvent the political wall that had just risen. But Australia had made its stance clear. They weren't simply saying no. They were sending a message. And this brings us to the first crucial question. Was this rejection purely political, or was it also personal? The answer is both. It is political because governments, particularly in democracies with nuanced relationships to monarchy and celebrity, must weigh public opinion and potential fallout. It is personal because the individuals involved, the Prime Minister, senior advisors, even local officials, understand the reputational weight of Meghan and Harry. They know the media spectacle, the potential PR storms, the social media backlash. They understand how every gesture, every public interaction, every photograph can be weaponized in ways that are impossible to control. The rejection, therefore, was not just a decision about a royal visit. It was a statement about influence, perception, and boundaries. But there's a deeper layer, one that is rarely discussed outside of inner political circles, the symbolic power of saying no. In this instance, the Australian government's refusal was a signal to the world. It told media, citizens, and even other governments that protocol, caution, and national interest would take precedence over celebrity influence, royal entitlement, or media spectacle. And for Meghan and Harry, accustomed to bending public opinion through narrative control, this was uncharted territory. They were, perhaps for the first time in their public lives, confronted with a situation they could not dominate or manipulate. So what does this mean for their future? For their brand? For their influence? If Australia can say no, what does that imply for other Commonwealth nations? How does this shift the dynamic between the Sussexes and the institutions they once relied upon? And more importantly, how will Meghan and Harry respond in a world where rejection is not just possible, but public, calculated, and unavoidable? These are the questions that underpin the tension of this story, the drama that will unfold in the chapters ahead, and the reason why the stakes are higher than they have ever been. But before we dive into the unfolding drama, the calls, the memos, the leaked emails, the media spin, and the fallout, it's critical to understand the personal dimension. Behind every rejection is a human story of pride, of ambition, of vulnerability. Meghan, fiercely protective of her image, striving to control perception, facing an emotional setback on foreign soil. Harry, a man torn between family legacy and independent identity, navigating the sting of public rebuff. Together, they represent a modern royal paradox. Extraordinary privilege coupled with extraordinary scrutiny, ambition tempered by relentless observation, and influence perpetually challenged by the very public they hope to charm. And that is where the story truly begins. Because in the world of royalty, media, and politics, a no is never just a no. It is a message, a lesson, and sometimes the first act in a drama that will unfold on a global stage. The moment the Australian Prime Minister's office closed the door on Meghan and Harry's proposal, the ripple effects began. The question is, how far will those ripples travel, and what storm lies ahead? The tension is already mounting. The strategy, the ambition, the desire to reclaim relevance, all collide with the cold, calculated reality of politics. And yet, even in this rejection, there are threads of intrigue, moments of human drama, and opportunities for unexpected turns. Because one thing is certain, when Meghan and Harry are denied what they crave most, they don't simply walk away quietly. They maneuver, they strategize, and sometimes they strike back in ways that few anticipate. And so, the question we leave you with as we move into the first chapter is this. When the most famous royal couple in the world is denied access to a nation that once adored them, what lengths will they go to, and what consequences will follow? The answer lies just beyond the next door, in the first chapter of a story that mixes ambition, politics, emotion, and spectacle. And what came next would change everything for Meghan and Harry in ways no one saw coming. What drives two of the most famous individuals on the planet to knock on a door they are almost certain will be slammed shut? For Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, it wasn't just a casual whim. It was a meticulously calculated attempt to reclaim a position they believed was rightfully theirs. After years of global scrutiny, high-profile interviews, and headline-grabbing ventures, the Sussexes faced a glaring reality. Their influence, once seemingly untouchable, was waning. And in their eyes, the solution was simple. Return to the stage that had once adored them, reconnect with a Commonwealth nation that had cheered their every move, and cement themselves as indispensable figures on the global royal map. Australia, with its deep-rooted royal connections and historical enthusiasm for British visits, seemed like the perfect canvas on which to repaint their narrative. But what they didn't anticipate was just how strategically resistant this nation would be, and how swiftly their ambitions would be curtailed. Imagine the scenario from the Sussexes' perspective. They are seated in a sleek, neutral-toned office in Los Angeles, advisors scattered around, laptops open, timelines plotted meticulously on whiteboards. Every detail of this proposed royal tour had been considered. The venues, the media coverage, the speeches, the photo opportunities. Each engagement was designed to highlight not only their philanthropic work, but also their continued relevance and connection to the Commonwealth. They imagined a flawless return, a wave of public approval, a reinvigorated brand. But behind that polished vision, there were cracks. They underestimated the lingering shadows of past controversies, the cautious nature of governments, and the hard truth that popularity doesn't automatically translate to political endorsement. The first step in their plan was strategic outreach. Emails were carefully crafted and vetted by PR experts. Language was measured, persuasive, yet deferential. A delicate balance meant to convey respect for protocol while subtly highlighting the Sussexes' potential contribution to Australia's cultural and diplomatic image. But sending an email is just the beginning. In the world of high-stakes diplomacy, particularly involving celebrities entwined with royalty, tone, timing, and intermediaries are everything. A single misstep could shift the narrative from anticipation to disaster. And as we would later learn, these initial communications were just the tip of the iceberg. Behind closed doors, the Sussexes team had meticulously outlined the benefits of their proposed visit. It wasn't just about personal glory. It was a strategic plan for soft power. They argued that public engagements, charity events, and cultural visits would strengthen ties between Australia and the UK, boost tourism, and generate positive global media attention. Every talking point was backed by research, media projections, and even social media analytics designed to demonstrate the couple's enduring popularity. From the outside, this appeared smart, persuasive, and high-minded. From the perspective of the Australian government, however, it was fraught with risk. You see, governments operate differently from PR teams. While the Sussexes were thinking about headlines and public sentiment, Australia was thinking about optics, precedent, and political liability. Security costs, media scrutiny, and the potential for domestic political backlash were all weighed heavily. Officials recalled past tours where royal presence generated not just applause but headaches. Overzealous fans, intrusive media, and moments of tension between staff and the visitors themselves. And the shadow of the 2018 tour, still fresh in memory, loomed large. What might appear as charm and celebrity to the public could very quickly translate into administrative headaches for officials. And Australia, famously pragmatic and politically aware, was not about to gamble its national reputation on star power alone. Yet despite these warnings, Meghan and Harry pressed forward. Phone calls were made to high-ranking officials, intermediaries were leveraged, and every interaction was calculated to maximize influence. Advisors whispered reassurances, emphasizing the couple's ability to sway public opinion and generate global attention. Every projected benefit was meticulously quantified. They believed that the sheer force of their public image would overcome any bureaucratic caution. But in reality, this was the very moment where their approach collided with hard political realities. No amount of star power could erase the memory of previous controversies, the sensitivity of Australian political sentiment, or the measured skepticism of experienced officials. And there was another layer to consider, the emotional investment. This tour was not just a public engagement, it was a lifeline. For Meghan, it was an opportunity to reclaim the narrative, to assert her agency, and to demonstrate influence on a global scale. For Harry, it was a chance to reinforce his identity beyond the confines of family scrutiny, to showcase leadership, and to reconnect with a country he had once visited in a different context. Together, they envisioned a triumphant return. The stakes were personal, professional, and, in a sense, existential. To be rejected would not simply be a logistical setback. It would feel like a denial of their significance on the world stage. When the official response finally arrived, it was precise, formal, and unmistakably firm. The Australian government did not mince words. The rejection was not couched in diplomacy meant to soften the blow. It was clear, deliberate, and strategic. Sources later indicated that senior officials had carefully considered every possible angle, risk, cost, optics, and precedent, before delivering a refusal that left little room for negotiation. And what's more, the refusal was not merely administrative, it carried symbolic weight. It was a signal to both the Sussexes and the world that Australia was no longer a stage to be commanded by celebrity or royalty alone. It was a message that national interest, prudence, and political calculation would always take precedence over glamour and influence. The immediate aftermath within the Sussex camp was electric. Advisors scrambled, phone calls flew, and teams convened to reassess. Meghan was reportedly frustrated, seeing the rejection as a personal affront, a challenge to her influence, and a public embarrassment. Harry, equally invested, explored alternative channels and attempted to leverage personal connections to sway opinion. But each effort ran into the same immutable reality. The decision was final, and Australia's stance was resolute. This was not merely a no to a tour. It was a rebuke to ambition unchecked by circumstance. Even as they sought to frame the situation in the media, crafting narratives that emphasized disappointment rather than defeat, the leak of the correspondence sparked global speculation. Headlines appeared across continents, scrutinizing the Sussexes' motives, questioning their judgment, and analyzing the political dimensions of the rejection. Social media erupted with memes, debates, and commentary, amplifying the drama far beyond the walls of any office or royal household. The story became larger than the individuals themselves, a case study in the collision of celebrity, royalty, and statecraft. This episode also raised larger questions about their public strategy. How could a couple accustomed to controlling narratives find themselves sidelined so effectively? Was this a miscalculation in approach, tone, or timing? Or did it reflect a deeper issue? The diminishing leverage of personal celebrity when faced with structured, politically informed decision-making? The answer is complex, layered with human ambition, emotional vulnerability, and institutional pragmatism. It is precisely this interplay of forces that makes the story so riveting, so instructive, and so dramatically compelling. And yet, even in the face of rejection, Meghan and Harry did not retreat. Their team began exploring alternative strategies, contemplating different countries, private engagements, and media campaigns to salvage influence. Each decision, each maneuver, carried its own risks and potential rewards. The drama was far from over, and the stakes continued to escalate with each passing hour. For every calculated step, there were unforeseen consequences, contradictions between public perception and private strategy, and the ever-present tension of global scrutiny. So here we arrive at the central tension of this chapter. The Sussexes' attempt to regain access, relevance, and favor collided with a world that no longer guaranteed compliance. The rejection by Australia was not just a setback. It was a mirror reflecting the limits of influence, the weight of past actions, and the uncompromising nature of national interest. And while Meghan and Harry may have believed in the power of their narrative, they were about to discover that sometimes influence has its boundaries, and the most sophisticated strategies can be met with immovable resistance. But as the immediate shock faded, the Sussexes realized that the story was far from over. Behind the scenes, communications continued, media strategies were recalibrated, and the tension between ambition and reality intensified. And it was in this crucible of expectation, rejection, and calculation that the next, even more dramatic phase of the saga would unfold. One that would reveal not just the personal stakes, but the political, social, and cultural ripples that their rejection had unleashed across continents. The question now becomes, how do Meghan and Harry respond when every planned path forward is blocked, when even their closest advisors begin to express doubts, and when the global media magnifies every reaction? What lengths will they go to reclaim momentum, and what unexpected consequences await them as they navigate this unprecedented rebuff? These questions set the stage for a drama that is as human as it is high stakes, and the answer begins in the very next chapter. The story of a request that was meant to restore influence, but instead ignited a chain reaction no one could have predicted. To understand the ferocity of Australia's refusal to Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's recent royal tour request, we need to travel back in time to 2018, a tour that, on the surface, appeared to be a celebration of royal tradition, but behind the scenes revealed cracks that would haunt the Sussexes for years to come. This was not just another royal engagement. It was a high-stakes foray into a nation that expected decorum, humility, and spectacle in equal measure. And while Meghan and Harry were seen by the public as charming, relatable figures, insiders and officials remembered a far more complicated reality, a memory that would color every subsequent interaction, including their audacious 2025 plea to return. The 2018 tour was meant to highlight the couple's engagement with Commonwealth nations, showcase their charitable work, and strengthen the bonds between the monarchy and Australia. Publicly, it was deemed a success. Photos of smiling royals greeting ecstatic crowds, lavish receptions, and media coverage portraying them as approachable and warm filled newspapers and social media. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Behind every polished photograph were frayed nerves, miscommunications, and mounting frustration from those tasked with orchestrating the tour. Protocols were stretched, staffers were overworked, and some advisors reportedly felt undermined by the couple's insistence on creative control. The story that later reached Canberra's bureaucrats and the media hinted at a pattern. A mixture of ambition, independence, and at times, defiance, that made the tour as much a management challenge as it was a diplomatic event. For officials, these memories were indelible. They recalled instances when decisions made on the fly disrupted carefully coordinated schedules. Invitations extended with precision were bypassed for last-minute photo ops. Requests for specific appearances or speeches created tension between local authorities and royal protocol officers. While the public only saw smiles and glamour, the logistical and emotional toll on staff and officials was profound. And in politics, memory matters. Decisions are not just based on the present request. They are informed by historical patterns, past behavior, and the perceived likelihood of repeat complications. For Australia's current leadership, these recollections were crucial in shaping their stance toward the Sussexes' renewed ambitions. Moreover, the media coverage of the 2018 tour had left its own mark. While headlines praised the couple's charisma, opinion columns and investigative pieces began dissecting the behind-the-scenes chaos. Articles highlighted the friction between the royal couple and local organizers, emphasizing moments of tension, misunderstandings, and apparent disregard for established protocols. Social media amplified these narratives, with snippets of controversy circulating alongside images of the smiling royals. Even subtle criticisms, once ephemeral, were archived and remembered, forming a digital dossier of concern. When officials in 2025 reviewed the Sussexes' request, these accounts were not just background noise. They were cautionary tales, reminders of the unpredictability and potential fallout that could accompany a visit. The emotional impact of these recollections cannot be overstated. Australia, known for its practical and pragmatic approach to governance, was wary of repeating history. The stakes were higher than simple hospitality or ceremonial engagement. Public perception, political optics, and national pride were intertwined with the tour's potential success or failure. Officials understood that allowing Meghan and Harry back without clear assurances could trigger criticism from opposition parties, ignite social media backlash, and even influence the discourse surrounding Australia's position in the Commonwealth. The 2018 tour had inadvertently set a precedent. Charisma and popularity were not enough to guarantee smooth sailing. But the story is not solely about administrative misgivings. At its core, the 2018 tour illuminated the couple's own expectations versus reality. Meghan, accustomed to managing narratives, sought to project control and influence. Harry, navigating the duality of family legacy and public image, pursued meaningful engagement but was still learning the complex dance of diplomacy and scrutiny. Together, they approached Australia with confidence, even optimism, believing that their presence would naturally inspire admiration. Yet, the juxtaposition of their ambitions against the realities of government bureaucracy and public expectation created subtle, yet significant, friction. This tension, though largely invisible to the public, was indelibly imprinted in the minds of officials and media commentators alike. And here lies a critical point. Memory and perception are often as powerful as actions themselves. The 2018 tour did not need to be a disaster for its impact to resonate. The mere perception of complications, staff fatigue, and procedural disruption created a lasting narrative. For officials evaluating the 2025 request, these perceptions became predictive markers, indicators of what might unfold should a similar tour be sanctioned. It was not simply about the Sussexes' current demeanor or intentions. It was about historical patterns, about lessons learned, and about risk mitigation. The significance of this historical context becomes even more apparent when considering public sentiment. Australia, like many Commonwealth nations, holds a nuanced relationship with the monarchy. Affection for royal tradition exists alongside critical awareness of media spectacle and celebrity culture. The public remembers, and so does the press. Any royal visit is scrutinized for authenticity, respect, and decorum. In 2018, the couple's charm was evident, but so were moments that suggested tension between expectations and delivery. These nuances, though subtle, reverberated through opinion polls, media analyses, and political briefings, forming a landscape in which any new request would be carefully weighed. Moreover, the political implications of past behavior extend beyond optics. Hosting a royal tour is not a mere formality. It is a complex logistical and security undertaking. Past instances where the Sussexes reportedly challenged or sidestepped staff guidance were flagged as operational risks. The cost of providing security, managing media access, and coordinating official engagements becomes a political liability if complications arise. In short, Australia's memories of the 2018 tour were not sentimental recollections. They were risk assessments, informing the caution that would later manifest as a refusal. Yet there is an ironic contradiction here. Despite these concerns, Meghan and Harry likely believed that their public appeal could outweigh any lingering caution. They may have assumed that their celebrity, their philanthropic endeavors, and their cultivated image as modern royals would render past issues irrelevant. They underestimated the weight of institutional memory, the diligence of government officials, and the stakes of political prudence. This disconnect between perception and reality is a recurring theme, one that would haunt the Sussexes' efforts and amplify the drama surrounding the 2025 rejection. The 2018 tour also revealed the emotional dimension of royal engagement, how individual personalities interact with institutions. Meghan's drive, Harry's determination, and their mutual desire to craft an enduring narrative sometimes collided with procedural expectations. This tension was not merely administrative. It was emotional, human, and highly visible to those managing the tour. Officials remember such dynamics not just for protocol, but for how they affect staff morale, media handling, and public presentation. In 2025, these memories influence decisions more than any current document or presentation could. As we transition from historical context to the present, it becomes clear that Australia's decision was not made in a vacuum. It was informed by decades of protocol, media scrutiny, and lived experience with the very individuals now requesting access. The rejection of Meghan and Harry's recent proposal is as much a reflection of institutional caution as it is a response to the couple's present intentions. And herein lies the drama. When ambition meets caution, when celebrity collides with governance, and when history whispers warnings that few heed, the stage is set for tension, frustration, and inevitable confrontation. So, what does this all mean for Meghan and Harry? It means that their charm, ambition, and carefully constructed narrative are no longer sufficient to guarantee acceptance or influence. It means that every action, every request, every appearance is filtered through layers of memory, risk assessment, and public scrutiny. And it means that the rejection they would later face in 2025 is not just a personal rebuff. It is the culmination of years of history, perception, and political calculation. But even with this knowledge, the Sussexes remained determined. They believed that charm, persistence, and strategic maneuvering could overcome institutional memory, media narratives, and political caution. They would soon find out just how formidable the barriers were, and that the echoes of 2018 were not just memories, they were warnings. And as we move forward into the next chapter, the question becomes, how did Canberra weigh these historical lessons against the present request, and what mechanisms of refusal were set in motion that Meghan and Harry could not circumvent? From the moment Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's request for a royal tour reached Canberra, it became clear that the Australian government would approach the matter with a degree of caution few anticipated. But what exactly goes through the mind of a nation's leadership when faced with a proposal from two of the most high-profile, media-saturated figures on the planet? In this case, the calculus was intricate, balancing political optics, national sentiment, operational logistics, and international perception. For the Prime Minister's office, the decision wasn't merely about hospitality. It was about governance, reputation, and risk management at a scale that dwarfed any celebrity engagement. The first layer of concern centered on risk. Not just security risk, though that was considerable, but reputational and political risk. Royal visits, especially by figures as polarizing as Meghan and Harry, have the power to ignite public discourse, mobilize media campaigns, and draw attention away from domestic priorities. Officials had to anticipate every possible scenario: media scrutiny, public protest, unexpected logistical challenges, and potential political backlash. Each aspect was meticulously analyzed. Security teams prepared simulations of worst-case scenarios. Advisors considered the political fallout of missteps, and communication officers drafted potential responses for every conceivable public reaction. The government was not just saying no out of caution. It was saying no because every variable pointed to a high probability of complications that could reflect poorly on Australia's leadership. Beyond risk, optics played a central role. Politicians are acutely aware of how appearances, even ceremonial ones, influence public perception. A royal visit is more than a cultural celebration. It is a visual narrative broadcast to both domestic and international audiences. Every handshake, every smile, every speech carries symbolic weight. For Meghan and Harry, whose global media presence had been both a boon and a burden, these optics were particularly sensitive. Canberra knew that permitting their visit would not simply generate headlines. It would invite scrutiny, comparisons, and inevitably, criticism. And in the age of social media, a single misinterpreted moment could escalate into a viral controversy within minutes, amplifying the risks exponentially. Political fallout was another critical factor. In Australia, public opinion about the monarchy is nuanced, shifting between affection for tradition and skepticism about relevance. Leaders had to anticipate questions from opposition parties, media interrogations, and citizen reactions. Would a royal tour be perceived as a frivolous expenditure of taxpayer funds? Could it be interpreted as favoritism, a political alignment with certain narratives, or a distraction from pressing domestic issues? The historical memory of the 2018 tour, with its behind-the-scenes tensions and occasional missteps, added weight to these considerations. Canberra's leadership recognized that a poorly managed visit could be a political liability, potentially influencing polls, public sentiment, and the framing of subsequent national debates. Operational logistics, too, were a formidable concern. Royal visits are complex undertakings, involving not just ceremonial arrangements, but security protocols, transportation planning, and coordination with multiple governmental and non-governmental entities. The 2018 tour had already tested these systems, highlighting how minor deviations or unexpected demands could create significant challenges. The thought of repeating similar complications, but now with media-saturated global attention, heightened officials' caution. They weren't just considering the optics of a single event. They were evaluating the capacity of the nation's infrastructure to accommodate a high-profile visit without disruption, embarrassment, or unforeseen incident. The interplay between these elements, risk, optics, political fallout, and operational logistics, created a formidable barrier. It wasn't a matter of personal animosity or a whimsical decision. It was a comprehensive, methodical assessment of what was possible, responsible, and prudent. And in every discussion, every briefing, and every internal memo, one conclusion became increasingly clear. Allowing the Sussexes tour was laden with challenges that could not be easily mitigated. What further complicated matters was the duality of public perception. While Meghan and Harry enjoy global fame, their notoriety is polarizing. Some see them as modern visionaries, champions of causes, and approachable royals breaking tradition in compelling ways. Others see them as media-obsessed, entitled, and willing to leverage personal narratives for profit and influence. Canberra had to weigh which perception would dominate public discourse. Which narrative would gain traction in the media? How might it influence Australia's international standing, domestic debates, or even relations with other Commonwealth countries? Every option carried consequences, and the stakes were amplified by the couple's history of high-profile controversies and carefully curated media presence. The emotional dimension of the decision cannot be understated. For officials tasked with balancing diplomatic courtesy and political prudence, there was a human element. The anticipation of public scrutiny, the knowledge that every interaction would be dissected, and the pressure to act decisively in the face of potential criticism. Rejecting a royal tour is not a trivial choice. It is an act that reverberates in public perception, media narrative, and internal governmental dynamics. Each argument, counter-argument, and scenario was debated with intensity. Advisors weighed the benefits of hosting against the very real likelihood of disruption, both practical and symbolic. The decision-making process was exhaustive because the consequences, should they err, could be immediate, irreversible, and amplified globally. Adding another layer, there was the historical sensitivity to consider. Australia, while steeped in Commonwealth tradition, is not blind to public sentiment about monarchy and celebrity influence. Officials remembered how the 2018 tour had both delighted and exhausted public patience, how media scrutiny sometimes overshadowed ceremonial intent, and how the couple's independent actions occasionally conflicted with expectations. These historical markers served as a cautionary framework. Canberra's leaders were acutely aware that history tends to repeat itself when precedent is ignored, and that allowing a repeat scenario could invite both domestic and international criticism. The careful, deliberate evaluation culminated in a decision that was unambiguous, yet diplomatically phrased. It was not rejection for rejection's sake. It was a conclusion grounded in thorough risk assessment, historical precedent, operational feasibility, and public accountability. The Prime Minister's office made it clear through both formal and informal channels that while the Sussexes' ambition and visibility were acknowledged, the potential downsides far outweighed any benefits. The message was unmistakable. Australia's leadership prioritizes responsibility, prudence, and national interest over celebrity allure and media spectacle. Yet, the Sussexes team did not accept this passively. Behind closed doors, there was frustration, disbelief, and urgent strategizing. Advisors worked to find alternative pathways, to appeal, to recast the narrative, and to leverage global attention to exert pressure indirectly. Calls were made, media outreach was orchestrated, and potential public campaigns were discussed. But Australia's position was firm, guided by comprehensive consideration and historical memory. The door that Meghan and Harry had hoped to step through remained resolutely closed. This episode illuminates a stark contrast between public perception and political reality. The Sussexes operate in a world where visibility, narrative control, and media presence are central tools of influence. Governments operate differently. Decisions are calculated, risk-assessed, and informed by historical patterns. When these two worlds collide, tension is inevitable. Celebrities accustomed to commanding attention encounter institutions designed to resist manipulation, and the resulting friction can be dramatic, public, and enduring. So, as we move forward in this saga, the question emerges: how do Meghan and Harry navigate a landscape where charm and influence are insufficient? How do they respond when their carefully crafted strategies collide with institutions that operate on caution, precedent, and responsibility? And what unforeseen consequences await as they attempt to salvage ambition against an immovable wall of political reality? These are the questions that set the stage for the next chapter, where a single memo, a seemingly innocuous communication, would ignite a series of events that would further entangle the Sussexes in a web of tension, strategy, and global scrutiny. It was just a few lines, buried within a routine internal memo, yet those words carried more weight than anyone could have anticipated. The memo was meant to summarize discussions, provide guidance to staff, and ensure that protocols were followed regarding Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's proposed royal tour. On the surface, it was administrative, perfunctory, unremarkable. But hidden between the neutral phrasing and the formal tone was a sentence that would ripple outward, shaping not only internal decisions, but also the trajectory of the Sussexes' ambitions and the global perception of the Australian government's stance. And for the couple, that line became a turning point, an unmistakable signal that their carefully constructed plan was meeting more resistance than they had ever imagined. The memo circulated quietly among senior staff, aides, and security personnel. Every word, every clause, every nuance was analyzed and debated internally. The line in question did not say no outright. Rather, it framed the visit in a context that highlighted risk, precedent, and potential complications. Any engagement with the Sussexes must consider the political optics and potential impact on national interest, it read. To a casual observer, that might appear to be a standard cautionary note, the kind of guidance that accompanies any high-profile event. But for those tasked with evaluating the proposal, it was a crystallization of the government's position, a firm, measured, and preemptive signal that while acknowledgement of the request existed, active approval was unlikely. For Meghan and Harry, the line in the memo was devastating, even if they didn't see it immediately. Their team, accustomed to navigating media narratives, assumed that the official channels would be swayed by charm, persuasion, or strategic framing. But here was the stark reality. The government's language was deliberate, carefully chosen to convey boundaries without overt confrontation. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of a cold shoulder, a message cloaked in protocol that communicated as clearly as any headline could. We are cautious, and we are skeptical. The implications of that sentence extended far beyond the immediate logistical considerations. Officials were signaling that the Sussexes' media presence, past controversies, and global notoriety could generate unpredictability in public perception and political narrative. The memo highlighted that the potential benefits of a royal visit, positive coverage, cultural diplomacy, tourism, were outweighed by risks, security challenges, media scrutiny, public debate, and political fallout. This was a comprehensive assessment, informed by history, precedent, and strategic foresight. In other words, Australia's hesitation was neither arbitrary nor emotional. It was calculated, deliberate, and backed by evidence. The memo also provided a subtle but unmistakable warning about precedent. Allowing the Sussexes to proceed without scrutiny could set expectations for future engagements, not just for royal visitors, but for any celebrity or high-profile figure seeking access to Australia's institutions. Officials were acutely aware that precedent matters. Once a boundary is crossed, it is difficult to reclaim. By embedding this line in the memo, they created a document that would guide internal decision-making and communicate a cautious stance, effectively managing expectations for all parties involved. Inside the Sussex camp, when the contents of the memo leaked, the reaction was immediate and intense. Advisors scrambled to interpret the tone, weigh possible responses, and strategize the next steps. Meghan, known for her meticulous attention to image and perception, reportedly felt a combination of shock and indignation. How could such a polite, measured line feel like a personal rebuke? Yet in the world of global media and public perception, subtlety often carries more sting than overt confrontation. Harry, too, was reportedly frustrated, recognizing that the language of bureaucracy had effectively neutralized their initial strategy. Their planned charm offensive, carefully choreographed with public appearances and messaging, suddenly seemed constrained by forces beyond their control. The memo became a focal point for internal discussion and strategy. Advisors debated whether it was possible to reinterpret or reframe the language to allow for a more favorable outcome. Was there room for negotiation? Could additional assurances, logistical proposals, or media plans sway decision-makers? Every suggestion was analyzed, but the underlying reality remained. The line in that memo was not a temporary hesitation. It was a reflection of a principled, deliberate stance by a government committed to maintaining control, managing optics, and safeguarding national interests. And then came the twist that would complicate everything further. The memo was not meant to be public, yet somehow, a portion of it leaked to the press. Headlines immediately seized upon the phrasing, analyzing every word for implication, intent, and meaning. Suddenly, a private administrative note became a global talking point. Media outlets speculated about the government's true intentions, public debates ignited on social media, and pundits dissected what the memo revealed about the Sussexes' perceived influence, or lack thereof. What was intended as an internal guide became a flashpoint for public speculation, adding pressure on both the Australian government and the Sussex camp. The emotional impact on the couple was significant. Meghan and Harry, who had envisioned a straightforward, strategically advantageous tour, were confronted with the reality that bureaucracy, precedent, and public scrutiny could not be sidestepped. The memo crystallized the boundaries. Australia was not an automatic stage for their influence, and charm alone would not secure approval. It was a stark lesson in the limits of celebrity and the power of institutional caution. From a broader perspective, the memo illustrates how language, tone, and phrasing can shape outcomes in high-stakes diplomacy and public relations. The careful construction of a single sentence communicated more than any direct refusal could have. It signaled authority, prudence, and strategic foresight, while leaving space for interpretation. To outsiders, it may have appeared neutral. To insiders, it was a line that defined possibilities and set the terms of engagement. In a world where perception is reality, that line carried enormous weight. The memo also highlights the dynamic tension between personal ambition and institutional constraints. Meghan and Harry, accustomed to exerting influence through narrative control, social media, and global publicity, were forced to confront a different paradigm, a system where decisions are guided by precedent, risk assessment, and collective judgment rather than individual celebrity. This collision between personal strategy and institutional procedure set the stage for the drama that would unfold in subsequent interactions, as every attempt to navigate or reinterpret the situation was met with calculated resistance. Even as the Sussexes' advisors scrambled to adjust, the implications of the memo extended beyond the immediate response. It influenced subsequent communications, informed the crafting of public statements, and shaped the parameters within which any further negotiations or appeals could occur. The line inside that memo became a reference point, a boundary marker, and a signal to all involved that Australia's position was deliberate and non-negotiable. Every step forward had to be measured against that unambiguous internal guidance. And yet, despite the clarity of the memo, Meghan and Harry were determined to press on. They mobilized media allies, explored alternative avenues of influence, and began crafting narratives that could reframe the situation in their favor. But as we will see, the careful, deliberate stance codified in that brief internal note would continue to influence every subsequent decision, interaction, and public perception. The memo was not just a document. It was a turning point, a quiet yet powerful declaration that would define the contours of the Sussexes' ambitions and challenge their assumptions in ways they had not anticipated. So the question becomes, how do two of the world's most high-profile figures respond when the first barrier is not a public rejection, but a carefully phrased internal caution? How do they navigate a landscape where ambition meets principle and where every attempt to assert influence is met with institutional prudence? And what were the next moves, both behind closed doors and in the public sphere, that would escalate this seemingly administrative issue into a global story of tension, strategy, and spectacle? These questions set the stage for the next chapter, where the personal reactions, strategic maneuvers, and high-stakes phone calls would escalate the drama to an entirely new level. The moment Meghan Markle read, or was informed of, the language in the memo, the reaction was immediate, intense, and deeply personal. For someone whose entire public identity had been built around poise, control, and influence, this calculated bureaucratic caution felt like a direct affront. It was subtle, wrapped in polite phrasing, and yet it carried a sting more acute than a blunt refusal. To the outside world, Australia's decision seemed measured, reasonable, and diplomatic. But inside the walls of Meghan's circle, it was interpreted as a public rebuke, a challenge to authority, and a threat to the narrative she had worked tirelessly to maintain. Her advisors recount a flurry of activity immediately following the memo's arrival. Staff huddled in small groups, laptops open, phones buzzing, trying to determine if there was any room for reinterpretation or negotiation. Every clause of the document was dissected. Every word was weighed for tone, implication, and leverage. It wasn't simply about planning a tour anymore. It was about damage control, narrative recovery, and a race against both time and perception. The stakes were high, not just for their public image, but for the credibility of the Sussex brand itself. Meghan's emotional response was a mix of shock, frustration, and determination. Shock, because she had believed that her strategic planning and media influence would create a favorable path. Frustration, because the memo highlighted the disconnect between expectation and reality. Determination, because retreat was never part of her playbook. She reportedly convened her inner circle immediately, demanding an assessment of how to shift the narrative and regain leverage. The conversation was intense, with staffers emphasizing caution and Meghan pressing for decisive action. The dynamic was high-stakes, emotionally charged, and emblematic of the tension between celebrity ambition and institutional restraint. Harry, meanwhile, took a different but equally urgent approach. Known for his attempts to balance familial legacy with independent action, he immediately began exploring alternative channels of influence. Calls were made to former contacts in Australia, intermediaries were engaged, and strategic messaging was discussed. The goal was clear: find a way to circumvent the perceived rigidity of the government's stance and reclaim some measure of agency. However, the same memo that fueled Meghan's indignation also constrained Harry's options. The Australian government's internal reasoning, backed by precedent and careful risk assessment, left little room for negotiation. In the days following the memo's circulation, Meghan and Harry's camp embarked on what could only be described as a frantic, high-pressure scramble for Plan B. Advisors brainstormed scenarios, weighing the feasibility of private visits, alternative routes, or mediated engagements. Each option was scrutinized for potential media exposure, public reception, and political acceptability. The emotional stakes were intertwined with strategic considerations. A poorly executed pivot could exacerbate the perception of failure, while a bold, uncoordinated move could alienate both government officials and the public. At the same time, the couple's team attempted to reframe the situation for media consumption. Press releases and carefully worded statements were drafted to emphasize disappointment without admitting defeat. Insider quotes were leaked to suggest persistence, commitment, and public goodwill. Yet the memo's wording had already set a public precedent. Once internal caution was translated into media coverage, the narrative shifted from possibility to limitation. What was once an internal discussion about risk became, in the public eye, a story about rejection, rebuke, and the limits of royal influence. The emotional weight of the situation was amplified by personal expectations. Meghan, accustomed to shaping narratives and influencing perception, felt the memo was a direct challenge to her agency. Every advisor, staffer, and intermediary became a participant in a complex game of influence, trying to recalibrate the narrative while managing internal tensions. Harry, navigating his own pressures, sought to maintain a sense of control, protect the brand, and explore potential avenues for leverage, all while confronting the stark reality that institutional caution was unlikely to be swayed by celebrity alone. One of the most dramatic aspects of this phase was the tension within their own team. Staffers, aware of the implications of public missteps, urged caution, recommending a measured, patient approach. Meghan, however, was pushing for decisive action. The resulting friction created an emotionally charged environment, where strategic discussions were punctuated by frustration, debate, and occasional conflict. This internal dynamic mirrored the larger tension between ambition and reality, a microcosm of the challenges the Sussexes faced on a global scale. Adding complexity to the situation was the inevitability of media scrutiny. Even before public statements were crafted, rumors about the memo began circulating. Speculation about the Sussexes' reaction fueled headlines, and social media commentary intensified the stakes. The couple's public image, painstakingly cultivated over years, faced the risk of being reframed not as strategic actors, but as figures encountering unanticipated limitations. For someone whose brand relies on perception, this represented both a professional and personal challenge. Despite these pressures, Meghan's response was characterized by swift action and strategic planning. Meetings were convened to explore alternative pathways, private engagements, mediated introductions, and outreach through sympathetic media channels. Every detail was considered, from optics to timing, from messaging to symbolic gestures. Harry's parallel efforts, focused on personal connections and strategic advocacy, complemented these moves. Together, their approach combined emotional resolve with calculated maneuvering, reflecting a high-stakes effort to regain influence, control, and relevance. Yet, even as plans were drafted and contingencies discussed, the underlying reality remained immutable. The Australian government's stance was deliberate, informed, and non-negotiable. The memo, while administrative in tone, represented a boundary that could not be easily circumvented. Each new strategy, however bold or creative, had to contend with this fundamental limitation. For Meghan and Harry, the lesson was clear. Ambition alone cannot overcome institutional caution and influence. Even global influence has its limits when confronted by principle and precedent. The emotional, strategic, and operational intensity of this period set the stage for subsequent developments. As Meghan and Harry attempted to navigate this landscape, they encountered further obstacles, unanticipated consequences, and escalating pressure from both internal advisors and external media. The intersection of personal ambition, institutional resistance, and global scrutiny created a scenario rife with tension, drama, and unpredictability. And it was within this crucible of reaction and strategy that the next phase of the story The escalation, the strategic miscalculations, and the global attention would unfold, setting the stage for the conflicts and revelations that would follow. So the critical question emerges: when influence, strategy, and ambition collide with unyielding institutional boundaries, how do individuals respond? And more importantly, how do those responses shape not only perception but reality, narrative, and opportunity on the global stage? Meghan and Harry's next moves, their choices under pressure, and the unfolding public reactions would define not only the success or failure of the tour, but also the broader trajectory of their global relevance and influence. The drama was far from over, and what came next would escalate tensions in ways that no one could have predicted.